Hello and welcome back. In this video I'm going to be making a leather sheath for this knife that I have. I started out by making this template out of paper just with some trial and error, and I came up with this design that seemed to work well. So I'm going to take this big scrap of leather here and cut out the template just by roughing out a section that I want to use, trying to fit what works best with the leather itself, and then just cutting it out here with a razor blade. Just a rough outline. There is some waste, but I'm starting to establish the straight lines on this piece of leather, and that's fine. So I can remove the bulk of that piece there and then just work with this small section. And I just trace the outline of my template onto the leather. I don't know if this is the correct way to do it. I'm not a leather worker. This is one of my first few projects that I've done. So everything that I'm doing is just me learning for the first time. Now using a straight edge here, I'm trimming that template out and then doing some freehand on those curved sections. Now I have that template replicated here in leather. And I'll be doing a lot of fitting up like this as the project goes along just to make sure everything still seems right. Now pushing it together, I'm scribing here with some dividers with a point on it that I want to use for a stitch line. I go about 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch or so off the end of the leather and scribe that line. And now this one is a 4-hole cutter, and I just go and keep the last hole in the one that was already cut so that I know I'm staying straight. And as this is curved, I make that gradual curve along that line that I made. And stop in an area that looks about right. And then once again, I do a test fit. Now I'm using some barge cement, which is my go-to for the few leather projects that I've done. It pretty much, you put it onto both surfaces that you want to attach and let it sit for 5 or 10 minutes. And then when you go back to put it together, those two sections will stick. So I apply it to that stitch line on both sides of the template. Close the lid because the stuff does smell. And then come back about 5 or 10 minutes later and I could push it together. And I use these pins just to make sure the alignment is right and that my stitch lines line up after they're glued together. Because once those are pushed together, it's very difficult to take apart with this barge. So I kind of work it down and just to keep the alignment and make sure my stitches are relatively straight. And then I come back through with a few clamps and just clamp it together and give that time for that barge to set up. Now coming back, removing the clamps and the pins, I'm left with this that's relatively stuck together all right. I do another test fit to make sure everything's still good, and it is. Now I'm using this wooden clamp here with some jaws made out of some scrap leather just to clamp it into place so I can stitch this together. Using the saddle stitch technique, which I read about and did some research on. Pretty much doubling up the leather in each hole. And you start one stitch away from the beginning and then go back on itself and then continue down the line, if that makes sense. Once again, I'm not a leather expert. I'm simply doing what I've seen and learning. But this seems to be the go-to method for stitching, and it looks a lot neater than the ones I've done in the past. So working my way down there, doing one stitch at a time and pulling it taut, I work my way all the way down to the end there. And then similarly, you go to the end of your line and then go back 1.5 stitches on the other one so that both of your pieces are on the waist side or the back side of your piece. Now I'm just lining up the belt loop here as I did before, just kind of eyeballing how much space I need. and just putting a little line there with a pencil just for where I'm going to apply the barge to, just so I don't over apply. So I just put a little line there on the end of the belt loop, and then there on the other side of it as well. And then I do the same thing. I wait a few minutes and pop it together. Here I jump through time a little bit. It's already all set up. I do a few test fits off camera to make sure it works on a belt loop. And then using that same divider, I can scribe my line. And I'm going to do a double stitch line here. So I do one line, and I about double the distance, and then scribe another line. And now using a full punch, I'm just kind of eyeballing center to see how I wanted to do this. Then I tap in those stitches there and repeat it on the other line so that they're centered over each other. And then apologies for the horrible lighting here. I was doing it so I could see, and it didn't work so well for the camera. But following that same technique for saddle stitching, I stitched those two sections in just to reinforce that belt loop joint. And then once again, I'm ending my stitches on the side that faces in towards your leg when you're wearing the sheath. Now the big final portion of the project, I'm going to attach this button here, this little snap. That kind of matches the brown. It's a little different shade, but it's close. That's what I have. So I line that up with the strap part, and I still need to get punches to punch in leather, but I use a drill and it works just fine. Then I'm able to put that snap in, put it on the little setting block, and then attaching the bottom piece, the part that snaps together. You just tap it into place there, and it expands the little circle on there so it gets tight. Now I was wondering how I was going to make an accurate line here, and I figured out that if I got it where I wanted, I could push down and make an imprint on that leather, and that worked just fine. And I was able to drill that hole out as well and put the other part of that snap together with the same method of tapping it in with that set pin and the punch. I do a few tests. It's very tight, but it'll wear a little bit, and I'm fine with that. And I just trim that end down to length and put a little chamfer angle piece on there just to give it some detail. And clean up that edge a little bit with a file. And I do a lot more of this filing off camera just to clean up those edges that were a little rough. But that's it. That's the first sheath I ever made. Turned out pretty well. I'm very happy with it. It's a process that I'm not very good with, but I'm enjoying it. It's something different than my normal woodworking. As always, I thank you all for watching, especially with this new process of me learning leatherworking. Please leave any suggestions in the comments or videos you'd like to see in the future. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you all for watching.